In the early morning hours, the Manitanska line still twinkled with lights. Inside his villa, Alexander Volkov had barely slept all night. He sat by the floor too, ceiling window in his study, watching the sky fade from deep blue to height, twirling a felt tip pen in his hand, spread out on his desk were negotiation drafts, financial statements, and a thin envelope sent anonymously. There was no signature on the envelope, and the message was simply, "Some people around you are not trustworthy." Alexander stared at the words, his thoughts swirling. He knew that today's negotiations would determine whether his 20-year feud with Richard could be resolved, and whether his business empire could be further expanded. Booth also knew that this was a fraught game, where a single misstep could lead to irreparable consequences. Downstairs, while Linda was preparing breakfast, she noticed that Haley hadn't slept all night and had dark circles under her eyes. Haley was thinking about the letter she found in the basement last night and decided to go to the Blue Heart nightclub to check for clues. While Rickard and Alexander were busy negotiating, "Don't push yourself too hard," Linda advised softly. "The atmosphere at home has been bad lately. Try not to cause trouble." "I know," Haley said with a forced smile, "but I can't sleep until I understand some things. You always have to protect yourself. The world outside is more complicated than you think." Linda clapped her hands meaningfully. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Richard arrived at the villa, accompanied by his lawyer and 2 assistants. The curtains in the living room were drawn tightly, and the table was covered with a contract, coffee, and a bottle of fine whiskey. Alexander and Richard sat across from each other, while Eric watched cautiously from the side. Everyone knew this was no simple negotiation. Richard took the initiative and delivered a slam. "The conditions you proposed are not sincere enough." Alexander remained calm and smiled. "I've already made concessions to the maximum extent possible. You should understand that this is not the time for you to have the final say." Richard sneered. "It's hard to say who will have its last laugh. Do you think there's no one around you who's tipped off?" Alexander's eyes darkened, sensing a hidden meaning in the other person's words. Under the table, he gently pressed the arm of the chair, signaling Garrett to be more alert. The lawyers began discussing the contract line by line, the two sides sometimes exchanging sharp words, sometimes laced with sarcasm. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Outside the reception room, Linda and Haley kept their ears perked up. Haley could even hear the security guards patrolling the door every few minutes. During the intermission, Alexander walked out of the living room and ran into Haley in the hallway. She whispered, "Is everything all right?" Alexander nodded and lowered his voice. "Don't worry. Where did you go today?" "I want to go out for a while and find something." At the Blue Heart nightclub, Alexander frowned slightly. "It's not very safe right now. Richard's been keeping a close eye on us lately. Be sure to call if you need anything." "I'll be careful." Haley nodded, but her determination to investigate the old casa became even stronger. Alexander stroked her hair and said softly, "You really don't need to get involved in these things, but I'm already in," Haley said firmly. The two exchanged glances, neither saying anything, yet the air was thick with unspoken concern and unease. After a break, negotiations resumed. Richard suddenly presented new evidence, an internal email implying that Simeon, on Alexander's team, had leaked confidential information. Alexander, forcing himself to remain calm, questioned the source of the evidence. The two sides engaged in another heated argument. Even slamming the table, assistants and lawyers took turns mediating, and the situation nearly devolved into a physical altercation. The living room door slammed shut, and the atmosphere in the villa instantly reached a fever pitch. Eric approached the door, ready to intervene at any moment. "How do you want to play?" Alexander gritted his teeth. "Guess," Richard sneered, his arms folded across his chest, his aura intimidating. Glass of whiskey was poured on the negotiation table, one after another. Everyone was enduring and waiting for the other side to reveal a flaw. Meanwhile, Haley arrived at the Blue Heart nightclub alone. She disguised herself and blended in with the crowd. The dance floor was dimly lit, and behind the bar was a familiar bartender. She whispered a greeting and tentatively asked about the nightclub's missing waiter. "That girl you were talking about, that's an old story," the bartender said in a loud voice, looking her over. "Don't ask around, or you'll get into trouble. I just want to help me friend find some clues. There are some people you could mess with, you know." The bartender looked around wearily. "There's been a big fuss about Richard and Alexander lately, so it's best not to get on the wrong side." Haley nodded, but she was even more determined to find out the truth. When she turned around, she suddenly felt Simeon staring at her from behind. She pretended to be calm and walked out of the nightclub quickly, but her heart was beating uncomfortably. When they returned to the villa, the negotiations were reaching a fever pitch. Haley paused at the stairwell just in time to hear Richard say coldly, Do you think you can keep those secrets hidden forever? I advise you to admit defeat as soon as possible. Alexander refused to give in, and said in a cold tone, you can try and see who lose more miserably in the end. The two confronted each other for a long time and finally parted on bad terms. Richard left angrily with his assistant and lawyer, and before leaving, he turned back and stared at Haley with a threatening and amusing look in his eyes. The room finally quieted down. Eric locked the door immediately, and Andy breathed a sigh of relief. After confirming it was safe, Richard won't give up. Alexander sat on the sofa, rubbing his temples tiredly. Haley walked over and asked softly, is it really dangerous? This is just the beginning. Alexander's tone was calm, but there was a subtle anxiety in his eyes. I just heard some rumors in the nightclub that someone seems to be keeping an eye on you for Richard. Haley gave the clue. Alexander smiled bitterly. I know, there are no secrets here. The two sat in silence, with suppressed and unfinished words floating in the air. Late at night, alone in her room, Haley read the letter over and over again, becoming more and more frightened. I can't be just a bystander anymore, she said to herself. Another anonymous text message arrived on my phone. Don't think you can escape. You're next. Haley felt cold all over, and the night seemed to grow heavy. Meanwhile, in his study, Alexander repeatedly reviewed every detail of today's negotiations. He opened his phone and looked at the anonymous reminder, his expression growing increasingly gloomy. He knew the enemy was closer than he had imagined, and betrayal might be just around the corner. He made an encrypted call. Activate backup plan. I will find out who betrayed me.
Please stay tuned for the next episode.
See you there.